My name is JoNina Abron-Ervin. I am 76 years old. I live in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I was born July 3rd, 1948. Well, I was born in Morristown, Tennessee, a small town in East Tennessee, where my parents met after World War II. They were teaching at an historically Black college. My mother was a music teacher. My father, a United Methodist Church pastor. They met there after World War II. A few weeks after I was born, we moved to Marshall, Texas, where my father took a job at another, it was also a Methodist, historically Black college. We lived there until we moved to Jefferson City, Missouri in 1953. By that time, I had a sister. I wasn't an only child anymore. I had a sister who was born in Texas. We moved to Jefferson City, Missouri in 1953, where my father took a job at Lincoln University, which was an HBCU located in the state of Missouri. He taught philosophy and religion, and he also was the founder of the Wesley Foundation at Lincoln University. The Wesley Foundation is a kind of like a Methodist church away from home for college students who identify as Methodists. So I grew up in Jefferson City from the time I was 5 until I graduated from high school in 1968. I was one of the first children in Jefferson City, Missouri, to integrate the public schools there in 1958. I was 8 years old, 1956. And Jefferson City public schools had been segregated. I attended a segregated school for kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. But after Brown versus Board of Education, the Jefferson City schools were integrated in the fall of 1956 when I was 8 years old. So I was one of the kids who helped to integrate the schools there at that time. And of course, I didn't know anything about Brown versus Board of Education. I may have heard my parents talk about it, but I was 8 years old. I was a kid. I didn't really know what it was all about. But I did know, I got from my parents' explanation that my attending school with white children was a big deal, because they told me, well, in September, when you go back to school, you're going to be going to school with white children. Now, before I had gone to school with Black children, which I don't think I thought that was a big deal because, I'm Black, and I just figured I was going to school with kids like me. But I got from my parents' explanation that going to an integrated school was kind of a big deal, even though I didn't understand anything about Brown versus the Board of Education. So, I grew up in a college town, Jefferson City, Missouri. Well, after I finished public schools in Jefferson City, I graduated in May of 1966. I attended a Methodist college because my father, as I said, was a Methodist minister. And I got a discount to go to a Methodist college. So I attended Baker University in Baldwin, Kansas, which is about 50 miles from Kansas City. I attended college there all 4 years. I majored in journalism, minored in political science. And in fact, while I was there, for the last 2 years I was in college, I was the co-editor of the campus newspaper there at Baker University. It was a small liberal arts college. It never had more than 1,000 students while I was there. And what I can tell, it hasn't gotten much bigger since then, but it had about 1,000 students, and there was never more than about 25 or 30 of those students were Black while I was there. At the time that I was going to college, a lot of the white colleges and universities they were under pressure to enroll more Black students. The Black Power movement had started by the late 1960s, and there was a lot of pressure on Black colleges, both public and private, to enroll more Black students. So that's probably one of the reasons why there was a fairly significant grouping of Black students there where I went at the time. So I went to college there, and it was a significant period of time because it was I started in 1966. I graduated in 1970. But there was a lot going on in the country at that time that affected my future. The Black Power movement was going on, of course, in the country. It was near the end of my sophomore year in college. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. This certainly was a key thing that happened. Robert F. Kennedy Sr., he was assassinated not long after that. The war in Vietnam was going on. There was a lot of stuff that was going on in the United States at that time. And all of this had an impact on me, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Certainly the assassination of Dr. King had a major impact on me. I had wanted to get involved in the Black liberation struggle. Anyway, for quite some time. I think one of the first things I guess you would say that helped to radicalize me was in the spring of 1963 when I was getting ready to start high school. I started high school in the fall of 1963, so I was only about 15 years old, and at that time, Dr. Martin Luther King and some of the civil rights leaders were waging a campaign for integration of the public facilities in Birmingham, Alabama. And some of the people that protested in that were young elementary school age kids. They were young. And, some of them were as young as my youngest sister, who was 5 years at the time. She's 10 years younger than me. And I was, it blew my mind to see these little kids out there on the streets in Birmingham, Alabama, marching and protesting. And then the police department there sicked, these police dogs on them, used the water, fire hoses with water to spray them and everything. And these were little children. And I wasn't old, but I was a teenager. And I said, wow, look at these kids. I said, if they can get out here and do this, then certainly I can, because, I'm older, And so that was one of the first things that definitely radicalized me, to see those kids, those really young children out there on the streets, a lot of them just in elementary school, protesting for civil rights. And then also the next year, there was the Mississippi Freedom Summer 1964, when they were doing the Voting Rights Project in Mississippi. And a lot of college students came from northern states to go to Mississippi to participate in the voter registration drive. I was only 16 at the time. I wanted to go, but my mother said, absolutely not. She said, that's Mississippi. That's a dangerous place for Black people. And you are not going. And of course, only being 16, I couldn't go anyway without parental permission. But one of the terrible things that happened that summer was that 3 of the people who went to help with the voter registration drive were murdered by some white racists there. Um, this would have been in June of 1964. And I remember when the news came out that they were missing. They had been traveling by car to do the voter registration. And there was a news flash that they were missing. And, I know that a lot of Black people felt like, man, this is Mississippi. They're probably dead. We didn't know it, but in fact, they were murdered. They were murdered by white racists who surrounded them and I guess beat them to death and killed them. And their bodies were found later. And that was something else that radicalized me. I thought, wow, they had gone down there. Some of the students were from the South, but many of the students were not from the South. And they had gone down there to help participate in that voter registration drive. And 3 of them wound up losing their lives as a result. And that had a great impact on me as well to help radicalize me as time went on. And I mentioned the fact that later Dr. King had been assassinated. So, there was a war in Vietnam. And, that helped to raise my awareness about what the United States was doing, overseas in foreign countries. I didn't really know, but I started to read information and to find out more about what was going on. And of course, there were some Black students who were killed at Jackson State University in Mississippi right before I graduated in May of 1966. And they had been protesting the war in Vietnam. And they were at Jackson State, which is an historically Black college in Jackson, Mississippi. And a couple of weeks later, there were students who were protesting the war in Vietnam who were killed at Kent State University in Ohio. And I think the Kent State protest was days before I graduated from college, just a few days, maybe a couple of weeks. All of these different things, helped to radicalize me. And I can't fail to mention that during the summer of 1968, about 6 or 7 students from my college, Baker University, and some faculty members, we participated in a summer study program in what was at that time a country called Rhodesia. It's now, of course, Zimbabwe, but at that time it was Rhodesia. It was still under control of a white minority regime. And I had never been to Africa, but I was excited to go. I went with, like I said, it's about 6 students from my college and some faculty members. I was the only Black student in the group. And Rhodesia was a country where Black people, had no rights, basically. In fact, it was, in a lot of ways, it was like Mississippi in the United States. But I had never been to Africa. And, I didn't understand, about what was going on in Africa. I had read about there being protests there in South Africa and everything, but I didn't really have a real understanding. And I thought because the continent of Africa mostly had Black people on it, Black people, were in charge in Africa, that they ruled the countries they lived in Africa. But when I got to Rhodesia, I found out this was not true, that in fact, Black people on the African continent did not, in most cases, rule the countries in which they lived. And certainly they did not in the country of Rhodesia. I was, as a journalism major in college, when I was participating in this summer program in Rhodesia, one of the things I did was to work on a Black newspaper. This particular newspaper there in Rhodesia was published by the United Methodist Church of Rhodesia. And I had never seen a newspaper that was censored, but this newspaper was heavily censored by the white government of Rhodesia. And when we would write the articles. The editor would have us write the articles we wanted to be in there. But then before it was actually, disseminated and distributed, government authorities would go through the paper. So when we saw the issue, you would see all these huge white spaces where the government had censored what we had written that they did not like. And I had never seen anything like this in my life, like it was. And I was, 20 years old. In fact, I celebrated my 20th birthday in Rhodesia. And I just had never seen anything like this. I hadn't seen this type of control or censorship. And at the time that I was in the country of Rhodesia, there was an armed Black liberation struggle going on. You had Black liberation forces were conducting an armed struggle to overthrow the white colonial regime so that they could have the Black majority can control their country. And where I lived in Rhodesia was not too far from the Mozambique border. And there were a lot of the armed liberation forces who were based in Mozambique, and I had a certain level of fear because I had never been that close to any kind of armed liberation struggle. I didn't know anything about all this. So all these things I have mentioned greatly, all these things contributed to my radicalization. I understood that the United States and its allies were, controlling the African continent, along with, of course, impeding on the rights of Black people and people of color in the United States with the police brutality that was rampant, and still a lot of Black people could not vote. So the years that I was in college, including the time that summer months I spent in Rhodesia in 1968, all of these things helped to radicalize me and helped me to understand that the world that I thought existed did not exist. And I began to have a greater understanding of what was going on. And, and by the time I was greatly radicalized by Dr. King's assassination, and had said at that point, well, as soon as I get out of school, I'm going to get involved in the Black liberation struggle, the Black Power movement. And after I got back from Rhodesia, I still had a couple of years in college, but that greatly solidified my conviction that I'm going to get involved. I'm going to be a part of the Black liberation struggle, the Black Power movement in the United States. And that's what I did. I should mention that before I joined the Black Panther Party ultimately, but before I joined the Black Panther Party, after I graduated from college, I did go to graduate school, Purdue University, where I got a master's degree in communication. I was involved in a committee that helped to draw up a proposal for a Black Studies program at Purdue University. The Black students there, before I got to Purdue, had protested the lack of Black studies, the lack of any kind of Black cultural programs at Purdue. So I, as a graduate student, I was on a committee that helped to formulate a Black Studies program for Purdue University, because again, this was going on around the country. Predominantly white universities, Black students were demanding that there be Black studies programs there on those campuses. So I was able to participate in that. I also, after I got my master's degree, I worked for a while for a Black newspaper in Cincinnati, Ohio. And then later I worked on other Black publications. The Black Panther Party. That was the first organization that I joined. I had found out about the Black Panther. The Black Panther Party actually started right after I started college in the fall of 1966. At the time that they started, I didn't really find out about them for almost about a year when they made national headlines marching into the California state legislature in Sacramento to protest this bill that was being passed to prevent people from carrying armed weapons. Up until that point, it was legal to carry a gun, an armed gun in the state of California. But when the Black Panther Party got started, they started conducting armed patrols of the police, monitoring police brutality, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Oakland, because the Black Panther Party got started in Oakland, California. And when they started doing that, you can imagine the government officials, the authorities, the police, the legislators didn't like that. So they said, well, we're going to have to strike down this law and no longer allow people the right to be armed. So the Black Panther Party had this protest in Sacramento, California, in May of 1967. I was finishing up my freshman year in college, and I wasn't even 19 years old yet. But I saw this, and I'll be honest, I thought the Black Panther Party was crazy, because I felt like, how can a bunch of armed Black people go into a government legislature with guns protesting? White people, I thought, are not going to let them do this. This is utterly insane. And that's what I thought. But as time went on, I began to hear more about the Black Panther Party and the fact that they were involved in a free breakfast program for children. They had seen that many children went to school who were poor and their families didn't have many resources. They went to school hungry. And the Black Panther Party began some survival programs for poor people. And one of those survival programs was the Breakfast for Children program. And I said, wow, this is really something, to be able to feed kids breakfast before they go to school, if their parents don't have the funds to do that. And I was really impressed by that. And I really liked that. And I said, well, I want to find out more about that. And the Black Panther Party had free food program, which I thought was really good because people knew that. And there were other survival programs. The Black Panther Party opened up free health clinics to help people who didn't have health insurance and who couldn't get, good health care. Black Panther Party started the first free nationwide testing for sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a disease that primarily affects people of color. It's a blood disease. And the U.S. federal government at that time was doing little or nothing to deal with sickle cell anemia. And primarily, they weren't doing anything because it mostly affected people of color. And they really didn't care. The Black Panther Party started the first nationwide free testing. And I thought, man, this is tremendous that this is being done to help Black people. So these kind of survival programs got my attention. And I said, this is really good. I want to get involved in this. And, the party had developed beyond the community patrols of the police, which were important. But the survival of Black people, having enough food and health, these were vital programs too. So I decided that I wanted to get involved in the Black Panther Party at that time. And I did in 1972, the summer of 1972, in Detroit, Michigan. At the time, my ex-husband, who was then my fiance, but now my ex-husband, he's from Detroit. And we joined the Black Panther Party in Detroit, Michigan, the summer of 1972, June 1972. Now, what's interesting is this was the second Black Panther Party chapter in Detroit. The first chapter had been established late 60s, early 70s, but that chapter, the FBI had been destroyed by the FBI counterintelligence program. And for those who are not familiar with the FBI counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO for short, This was a program that was initially begun in the late 1950s to spy on and destroy the Communist Party in the United States. But in 1967, the counterintelligence program, there was a special one set up to destroy the Black Power movement. This was set up in the summer, the summer of 1967. And this was set up to disrupt, destroy, and discredit the Black Power movement. And this was a program that was started by J. Edgar Hoover, who was then the head of the FBI in the United States. And Hoover sent a memo to all the offices in the country, FBI offices in his country, to come up with ideas, plans, and activities to destroy the Black Power movement, which was attracting a lot of youth. And Hoover understood that attracting youth was very serious. And they definitely wanted to, stop these programs because they feared what would happen if a lot of youth got involved in the programs. So what happened in Detroit, the FBI counterintelligence program in Detroit destroyed the first chapter of the Detroit Black Panther Party. And if you look at the final report of the FBI Counterintelligence Committee, the committee that was set up to just study what was done by the FBI, you will see reference to the Detroit, the program that was set up in Detroit to destroy the party. And specifically what happened there was that an FBI counterintelligence agent, somebody who was in to spy and destroy the Detroit Black Panther Party, he convinced some members of the Black Panther Party to go and sort of raid this or destroy this drug house, a place that was known to distribute drugs. And the Black Panther Party, of course, one that was against, drug trafficking, because we saw how the drug trade was destroying our community. And this particular person convinced about 3 of the members of the Black Panther Party to go in and, overtake, raid or destroy this so-called drug house. And unfortunately, a young Black man who was at that house was killed. So the result was that the Black Panther Party members were arrested and convicted of murdering this young man. And of course, this in effect helped to destroy that initial Black Panther Party chapter that was set up in Detroit. And, I bring this up for people to understand the extent to which the police agencies, the FBI and local police departments around the country went. They set up a whole program to destroy not only the Black Panther Party, but also other Black Power movements. But the reality is that over 90% of the COINTELPRO operations, over 90% were set up to destroy the Black Panther Party, because J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, considered the Black Panther Party, as he said in a memo to his agents, to be the single greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. And that's why the counterintelligence program was primarily directed at the Black Panther Party. But anyway, so in the summer of 1968, permission was given to reestablish the Black Panther Party in Detroit, Michigan. And I joined that. And ultimately, we relocated, those of us in Detroit relocated to Oakland, California, which is where the Black Panther Party was originally founded, which was the headquarters. The leadership of the Black Panther Party wanted to make Oakland, California, kind of a base of operations for the party. Wanted to make that the main place where we carried out our programs and the things we were trying to accomplish. And so it called for all the Black Panther Party members in the different cities around the country to come to Oakland. to continue our work in Oakland. So those of us in Detroit, we left Detroit in about February, March of 1974. And we went to Oakland. When I got to Oakland, because I had experience in journalism, I was assigned to work on the Black Panther newspaper, which at that time was a weekly publication. Now, the Black Panther Party, in the late 60s, early 70s, was one of the most popular Black newspapers, one of the most popular left radical newspapers in the United States. In terms of Black newspapers overall, only the Muhammad Speaks, which was a newspaper of the Nation of Islam, that was the only Black paper who had a higher circulation than we did. Our paper was circulated, was very popular around the country. And it was actually, and again, that was another thing that the FBI counterintelligence program sought to destroy, because it was a popular newspaper. And it was, the main way we got our message out to people around the country. And so the FBI did things like, find out where our newspaper was stored in different warehouses around the country, and it would burn copies of the newspaper, things like that, because it didn't want the newspaper to be distributed. That's how important that they considered it to be. But at any rate, I worked on the newspaper. That was my primary assignment when I got to Oakland. And I should say that right before we left Detroit to come to Oakland, when I was in Detroit working in the party, I worked in the free breakfast program for children. We did, during the school year, when kids were in school, we did have a program for them in Detroit. And I worked in that program to help, serve the hot breakfast to the children there in Detroit. I also sold the Black Panther newspaper in downtown Detroit. I mentioned a few minutes ago how the Muhammad Speaks, the Nation of Islam's paper, was a widely circulated newspaper among Black people at that time in America. So we had a basically friendly competition between those of us in the Black Panther Party selling our paper and the people in the Nation of Islam selling Muhammad Speaks. So we would be in downtown Detroit. We'd be on one corner selling the Black Panther newspaper, and across the street on the other corner would be people from the Nation of Islam selling Muhammad Speaks. So it was a pretty friendly competition, more or less, but it was a competition.